Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Palmer's Great Wednesday webinar series. We are thrilled that you are here. We are in for a treat tonight. And so I would like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Will Willimon tonight, who will be in a conversation with the Reverend Neil Willard. And I'm going to do a quick introduction. It's hard to do a quick introduction when you have the list that this gentleman has of accomplishments, but I do want to share this with you. The Reverend Dr. William H. Willimon is professor of the practice of Christian ministry at the Divinity School, Duke University. He served 8 years as bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church, where he led the 157,000 Methodists and 792 pastors in North Alabama. For 20 years prior to the episcopacy, he was dean of the chapel and professor of Christian ministry at Duke University, Durham, North Carolina. He is the author of roughly 100 books. His worship as pastoral care was selected as one of the 10 most useful books for pastors in 1979 by the Academy of Parish Clergy. Over 1 million copies of his books have been sold. In 1996, an international survey conducted by Baylor University named him one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. Bishop Willimon has given lectures and taught courses at many pastor schools and at colleges and universities in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. These include the Belden Lectures at Harvard, as well as lectureships at Princeton, Vanderbilt, Pepperdine, and Oxford. In 1998, he served on the theological faculty of the University of Bonn, Germany. And in 1991, he was distinguished guest professor at the University of Münster, Germany. His books have been translated into 10 languages. There you go. There could be more, but I decided to stop there. So welcome, sir. We are thrilled that you are with us. And I am going to now turn it over to Neil Willard. If anybody would like to ask questions, please leave them in the chat. We will watch that. We also have the question feature enabled, so you're able to post questions as well. We will talk for about 40 minutes, the two of them will, and then we will have a question and answer period for the remaining 20 minutes. So thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you, Roger. And it's a real honor to be able to have this conversation with you tonight. And I just want to set some things straight right off the bat. First things first, I mostly know about you through your many years and your many sermons as Dean of the Chapel at Duke University. And I grew up on Tobacco Road there in North Carolina, further west outside of Kernersville, and I went to college close to home at Wake Forest University. So we have Demon Deacons and Blue Devils represented in this conversation, which I've immediately confused some people probably watching this who don't know about the mascots of those universities. And I'm wondering, is there any theological significance to the fact that these two private universities that have explicitly Christian roots have these unusual, ironic
demonic mascots? I don't know the theological significance. The Blue Devil as the Duke mascot was named for around World War I for a French fighting unit that the Blue Devils that were of some note in World War I. It's a very odd connection. The president of the university used to have a person who wrote him every week a pleading letter, change the Duke mascot from the Blue Devils. This is leading our young people astray into Satan worship. And he asked me to respond, and I said, Madam, if you only knew how many things you need to be concerned about going on at Duke University, more detrimental than the mascot. But
I had wondered if that ever caused consternation among some Methodists. But
did among that correspondent.
Before I ever set foot here in the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, I think were here probably for some clergy conference. And while you were here, sometimes they'll do video interviews with people who are in town. And I watched that video and I've really thought about it a lot because you were asked one question that I recall. And the question was, why go to church? And I remember two things about that. I remember that you didn't like the question, the way it was phrased, but as if there's some kind of obvious, utilitarian answer that you're going to unveil like a magician, and then millions of Americans going to walk through our church doors the very next Sunday. And that was an interesting reflection just on the question. But then you told a story near the end of that about a young adult who walked through a different door, the door of a hospital room. And she had an experience that changed her life, an experience that I thought really got to the heart of the question, about why would anyone go to church? Now, I don't know if you remember that story. I can summarize it if you don't, but I thought it was kind of an interesting prelude to some of the other themes that we might talk about tonight about community.
As I remember, it was a Duke student who was a very bright young woman that I knew because of a service project. And she did not grow up in the church, or if she did, she didn't remember anything about it and all. But her grandmother was very ill and near death. And she told me, she said, I don't know what to do. And anyway, I watched as a Methodist preacher kind of came in and said, and took charge and said, here's what you do at a moment like this. Could we all hold hands around the bedside and with your grandmother? And then I'm going to ask you to remember tell me one great thing that is special about your grandmother. And then ask the grandmother, what would you like us to pray for and all? Anyway, then led us in prayer. And after it's over, the student said, I don't want to ever go through anything like that again alone. I need some training. I need some help. And I said, glad you asked. Welcome back to the church. Which may be a kind of segue, Neil, to that aging, to say the demands of aging, the demands in your last quarter of life are such. Don't go there without some help. You need the church at that time more than you'll ever need the church. And that's a prejudiced Christian comment, right. But I think I could prove it in the lives of many aging persons.
Now, that's an interesting story too, because it links the need of older people, as you say, in that last stage of life to not be alone. But that young adult realized that she didn't need to be alone either, or she didn't want to.
That is amazing. And church for most of us is one of the few intergenerational things that we're involved in of note. And I served for a year a Methodist church in Durham, North Carolina, while I was teaching too, a couple of years ago. And we had a lot of young adults moving into the apartments around the church, and they would show up on Sundays. And I would ask them, wonderful to have you. What's drawn you here? I was amazed how many responded to me. I miss my grandparents, or I'm looking for some gray hair. To which I said, well, it's a Methodist church. We got a surplus of that here. Go ahead, pick out a grandparent. You can have any of them you want. Just pick one out. They're yours. And, but I said later, the challenges of being a young adult, getting started out and all, are just too difficult to do without grandparents. And I'll add, being over 65 can be too difficult to be done without grandchildren. Mm-hmm. So therefore, the church has this rite we call baptism. And in baptism, we say, hey, you need grandchildren? Here's one right now. Yeah. Take responsibility. I love it when the church, just by being the church, becomes a redemptive, deeply helpful thing to people as they're negotiating transitions in life.
Well, let me ask you something related to that. We are going to ask some questions about, talk a little bit about aging. You just wrote a book recently, and the title is Aging, Growing Old in the Church. And I feel like the moment I say that, I need to tell everybody who's watching this to hang on. I feel like I need a prelude to that, that I might not have needed 100 years ago. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of like bringing up children in church, in a conversation. Half the congregation gets really excited and other people are saying, well, I don't have kids, or my kids are grown up. We live in an age where we've prioritized everybody going into their own corner of the room and hanging out with their group, with kind of losing the sense, like at baptism, the entire congregation is taking on some responsibility to help raise a child in a community. So everybody's involved in that. I mean, those words either mean something or they don't. But the same would be true of aging. Now we've all been children. Most of us will become older people. Some people won't because they die prematurely, but it is something that we're all connected to, even if we're not old ourselves, but we are getting older. But do you feel
Yes.
that sense of, is it difficult as Americans to kind of have that? Have we lost a little bit of that intergenerational commitment, or the understanding that we are part of the whole?
I wonder, I do think it's been noted for a long time in our culture that we don't have that kind of extended family, multi-generational
Right.
commitments in our families that many cultures do. I know I've got friends, for instance, African-American pastors, and they were saying in the African-American churches they serve, people are determined never to let their loved ones go into an institution, a nursing center. And he said it's a real problem because many of them just can't provide it, but they're very strong about that. Your first point, aging is something that everybody is participating in. Aging begins at birth. It accelerates the effects of it in the last half of life, but one might, from a certain perspective, see that church is preparation for aging. John Wesley used to brag, our people know how to die.
Mm-hmm.
And Wesley said, Methodism is preparation for the end, at whatever stage you take it up in life. Well, I think we probably have lost that. But as you say, we've also lost what I think is a Christian wonder. And that is Christians from day one have taken responsibility for other people's children.
Right.
And for other people's parents. In my church, we spent the 19th century building orphanages and homes for other people's children that we accepted responsibility for. Then we spent the 20th century building homes for other people's parents, that we accepted some responsibility for. I think that's deeply Christian and very important. And in fact, something the church already knows how to do, and something a functioning congregation already is doing quite wonderfully.
The notion of, you mentioned John Wesley's notion about, getting ready to die. And, there's a sense in which if a person's going to contemplate how they're going to die well, what they're really contemplating is how to live well up to that moment, up to that final breath, in a sense. And, why is it so hard for some of us to do that? I mean, at Palmer, we hear the life flight helicopters landing across the street from our church during our services at the Technology Center. And now that we're doing those outside, you really hear them. And we're always used to hearing the ambulances are going when the church doors open up. So it's a little more present in our setting. And certainly as a priest, I mean, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about death at least a little bit. I mean, it's part of every day, and it's not a terrible thing. It's just something that I do. But so many people find that difficult to do. They spend time not doing that.
The church, I know one of my quotes from the T.S. Eliot, who was an Anglican, as you know, he said, why should people love the church? Because she tells them of sin and death
Yeah.
and other unpleasant facts of life they'd rather forget. And that I'd love that to, like, I'll be ending a sermon at Palmer Church, and we hear the helicopter coming in, and for whom does the helicopter descend? Is it for you? Well, hey, you guys, Episcopalians, I mean, you're getting ready next Wednesday, and you will stand up before people who, many of whom look really good and are in good working order. And you'll say to them in so many words, I'm sorry, but you've come from dirt and you're going back to dirt. And that's not an injustice. It's just the way the world, that's the way life is. And think about it. I've always, Ash Wednesday was always kind of a highlight for me when I was a college chaplain serving at Duke Chapel, because it was quite a rush to stand in front of a 19-year-old and say, even though you scored 1350 on the SAT, you are mortal. Even though you look really good right now, this is a predictable part of life, is leaving life. And also, I try to be kind of honest in the book up front. The reason aging can be such a challenge is death. This is the prelude. And whereas through much of our lives, you may have been able to sort of evade that fact, in the last quarter of life, it's really difficult to evade the next step.
I have actually a personal experience a little bit. I feel like it's the first step toward that. And because you don't have to be, thinking back to that hospital room, you don't have to be on the last page of the last chapter of your life to have a sense of time slipping away. And I've told this to our Tuesday morning men's Bible study, that last summer, when I turned 50 years old, I had this profound awareness of something that was just as true the year before as it was last summer. But it just came into sharp focus on my last birthday. And that was the profound clarity I had that there was suddenly more sand in the bottom of the hourglass there was in the top of it. And it wasn't a terrible thing. It reminds me of something the Bishop of Texas once told me about something. I said, well, is that good news or bad news? And he looked at me and said, it's just news. And I know it sounds funny to say that I suddenly, became aware of that, because it obviously doesn't happen suddenly. But the reality of it weighed on my mind suddenly, as if it had just happened in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
And when we have a moment like that, awareness of the shortening number of years left in our life, how should Christians react to that? Or how do you?
I think sometimes we react in different ways. I do say that, in a sense, aging is a moral test. Mm-hmm. How well have you prepared yourself for life's ending? Christians believe that there are actually some things you can do and think about, pray about. There are insights you can have that enable you to go into the last quarter of life with a bit more confidence, dignity, hope than you might if you didn't have that. One could say that the church is that kind of long-term preparation. I mean, for instance, funerals.
Right.
Who's a funeral for? Well, it's for the grieving family in the acute crisis of grief. But in a way, you might think of the funeral as educational. To say to me, in effect, now your mother has not died, but your mother will die. And when your mother dies, listen in on what we're saying to these people whose mothers just died. I remember when I was a young pastor serving a church in rural Georgia, and went to a funeral in another church, somebody, a relative of mine, of somebody in my church. And I had never seen a funeral like this. The casket was open. The pastor, the preacher, was storming around in there, and he said, "Too late for old Joe. He's dead. Oh, he might have wanted to do something with his life. He might have wanted to do something for his Lord. Well, he's dead. He can't do that now." I was thinking, this is the worst thing ever. So what a comfort to the grieving family. So on the way home, I said to Patsy, I said, that was the most manipulative, horrible thing I've ever seen at a church service. And she says it was manipulative. It was horrible. And she said, the worst thing about it, it was true. And I said, wait, what do you mean? And she said, well, it is too late for Joe. He is dead.
Yeah.
It is not too late for me and you. And I love it when the church tries to help me see reality and tries to help me think about things that I would rather postpone thinking about. And I remember with going in to see a man right before some very serious, potentially life-threatening surgery. And I walked in the room and he said, well, preacher, you know, all those sermons that you stand up and harangue and everything, all your Democrat leaning sermons. And I said, what? He said, it's exam time. We're going to find out now just how closely I've been listening. And I said, what a beautiful definition of preaching and listening. So, and I think, as I say in the book, I think there are things churches can do. I think we ought to be aware of the preparatory work we're doing for people in that regard.
Speaking of, there are other kind of deaths that people kind of encounter that are, maybe positive things. You said the church helping us see they are. There's a different story that I remember you telling about when you were the dean of the chapel at Duke, about how you would every year you would get a handful of calls from angry parents because they had sent their kids to a really expensive private university, and then they had stumbled into, while they're doing their real work, they had stumbled into the Wesley Fellowship, and it gave them all these crazy ideas, and then they're about to get their degree, and they want to go off and work with Mennonites or something like that, and they want you to stop it as the highest kind of religious authority, almost asking you to do this in the name of Jesus, but so sometimes that doesn't always happen early, but sometimes we have these moments of clarity along the way.
Yeah, well, the bucket list syndrome.
Yeah.
When somebody says, gosh, I'm now 60. If I'm gonna do this, I better do it. And there are many people who can testify. I know my mother worked 12 months a year as an educator, school teacher. And we went to church on Sundays, but that was all we did with the church. When she retired, she really enjoyed suddenly getting to be an active church member in a way that she couldn't when she was working. And it can be good to say, hey, if there's something that you need to say to somebody, hey, say it. You're getting on in years. If you need to ask for somebody's forgiveness, get on it. If you need to offer somebody forgiveness, get on it. I think it'd be great if we could see our older years as a blessing. And it's the blessing of time. Our forebears, just a couple of generations ago, could never have imagined that they could have the luxury of retiring, of reaching my age. And we should see that time as a kind of gift of God to be used for God.
I have a question related to that. So I had an uncle, a man who married one of my daddy's sisters, who was for a decade, closer to the end of his life, the faculty marshal at UNC over in Chapel Hill and in North Carolina. And he just loved that institution. He was a great cheerleader, for Carolina. And I see that same kind of spirit in certain retirees they become cheerleaders for their churches, or they volunteer at organizations, whether it's at hospitals or museums or volunteer organizations that help the poor, whatever it is. They sort of take on this mantle, this spirit of uplifting people around them and the mission.
That's a nice image.
Yeah, but then I also see people who do the opposite. A spirit of criticism.
I do.
Are we built that way, or are there things that we can do to?
As bishop, one of my great challenges was retired clergy, and
yes, some people do that well, and some people don't.
I longed that they would find something else to do other than criticize and negate and discourage. But I love that image of cheerleader. I've said that we older persons have a tough job in that many times we've learned a lot in life. We got a lot of experiences, a lot of wisdom, and we want to share that. And maybe younger generations badly need to hear it. However, it's kind of better if you wait till they ask for it than before you dump it on them. And and at the same time, it's though we can be great practitioners of the ministry of encouragement, right. And we kind of have a duty to say to the younger generation, hey, I enjoyed being an officer of the church during my time, and I did the best I could on the vestry, but now it's your turn, and I wish you well. And I think it's also important along with that to say, maybe to take that example, I enjoyed being a part of the vestry, and we tried to make good decisions for the future of the church, but I'm fully aware you can't be the same church that I led.
Sure.
You're going to have to be a different church. Your challenges are different. So Godspeed. Let me know if there's ever I can offer you any insights. Glad to do it. And sometimes I know sometimes university administrators, I've noted in my latter years, will actually ask me, well, what do you think I ought to do here? Or how would you handle this? Well, there is a kind of luxury of being older. I'm not going anywhere. Right. I'm not on the make to try to get my resume together to go somewhere else.
Sure.
All that's past now. So it gives a kind of freedom to be able to speak the truth and to say, well, I'll tell you, since you asked, I would really think you'd be wise to do it this way. So
I have a question that really doesn't just relate to growing older. It certainly relates. I feel like before the current pandemic, this was something that was a growing problem in American society about disconnectedness and loneliness, even though people feel like they're more connected, online and in other ways, social media. And certainly during the pandemic, all that has just been magnified. And it's a real problem for people who are older, live alone, younger people who live alone. And I have this memory of my granddaddy Willard. He was actually born in 1894, and he lived to be 98. And somewhere along the way, I remember him coming to a funeral at the church out in the country, the Moravian church that I grew up in. And just so happened he and I had gotten there early. And so I sat in the car with him, and I didn't really my dad was one of 11 children. I didn't have a chance to do something like this very often. And at one point while we sat there, he said to me that one of the hardest things about growing older, and I mean growing much older, isn't that you don't love your children and your grandchildren if you happen to have those things as a part of your household, but that everyone you ever knew growing up, every peer that you ever had, siblings, at some point they're all gone. And there comes a day, if you live long enough, that you're the only one left.
Yeah.
And so, I know that's an extreme example, but there is this sense of
I think it's
what do people do with that?
You've done plenty of funerals where the deceased has all their siblings are gone, all their friends. Loneliness is a real factor in later life. And I think there's no denying that. And in fact, we need to confront that. One thing in my research for this book that really came through that surprised me was studies of the aged are showing how very, very important is socialization in successful, healthy aging. One person claims that a study showed that chronic loneliness, aloneness for older people can be the health equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for your life. I mean, it's that detrimental. And socialization, not simply, keeping in contact with your older friends, but for instance, the Harvard Grant study of the class of 1947, been tracking these men all through the years, showed that for men, a very important factor they've isolated among factors of those who've aged well into their latter part of life is interaction with younger people, particularly younger men, being a mentor, being able to say, yes, he's my protege. And it a kind of a light went on and I thought, gee, I've got some, former students and all that I guess are my proteges. And they call me from time to time and say, I've got this job possibility. What do you think? And I have to admit, I just love that. I'm thrilled by that. And I said, thank you for asking. So it's a big issue and also a very important way for the church to be helpful. And I think, for instance, one of the things that we pastors need to be good at is to a young person, a young adult shows up at our church, they're new in town, they're just starting their career, they're alone, their family lives in a little town somewhere in Texas. Great to say, I want to introduce you to some people that I bet would love to know you. And then she says, oh, you remind me so much of my grandparents, or, so that the loneliness thing is something I think people are paying a lot more attention to at every stage in life, but it is a major factor in older life.
You talked about the importance of socialization just for overall health. And, one of the things that we learned here in Houston when the city implemented a program to really try to help the vast majority of people who are homeless enter a new way of life was through housing the homeless. And one of the things we learned in the process of that was one of the most important things that we could do just as human beings for them wasn't other people were taking care of services for them, but it was just to show up in these communities where they're being housed just to be with them.
Yes.
And it is not like it was you sort of think of it like there must be something more to do, but that was something that was emphasized about this is a really critical thing for people.
I bet you a number of people on tonight have been volunteers active in Meals on Wheels.
Right.
And one thing they tell you on Meals on Wheels, the meal is essential and important, but don't just deliver the food.
Right.
What they tell you is, I'd rather have the conversation than the food.
Right.
Stay for just a minute, talk. And I do think the church could be a great place for getting those kind of social connections. I remember, for instance, young pastor, I created a divorce recovery group.
Sure.
I had a couple of young marriages that came apart, and I became very concerned about the persons going through this, principally the wives. And so I said, I'm going to start a divorce recovery group made up of, and if you've been divorced and you're working that through, please come if you want to. And I had in mind these 20-something women whose lives had been turned upside down by this. I walked in the room, and the first people in the room were in their 60s and 70s.
Wow.
And their divorce had occurred for some of them 30 years before. They were still dealing with that. They were still recovering from that. And I thought, wow, this is why we need intergenerational opportunities. And so.
Now there's the other phenomenon, and this can happen again to people of all ages, and maybe it goes back to that question about what kind of retiree you're going to be or what kind of person you're going to be at any stage of life. There are people who show up at church, but it's really more like a chapel. So I go there and then I leave immediately. And you can essentially participate that way and remain lonely. I mean, you know what I mean? You could still be a lonely person. It's like being a lonely person in a city.
Sure.
If you
church could make you as lonely as you've ever been.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody's smiling and backslapping and all, and you think, I don't know them, and
yeah,
they don't know. And again, I bet you in the future we're going to have to work harder and harder to create opportunities for connections and relationship. I also think, as a pastor, I used to. Somebody would visit our church, and then I'd talk to them about joining, and they'd say, "This is the friendliest church." And I said, "Well, what's really attracted you to the church?" "Oh, it's so friendly." I said, "Yeah, well, how about the sermons? Aren't they great?" They never said the sermon.
Right.
And I thought, well, the Christian faith is about friendliness, yeah, but it's about a lot more than that. Mm-hmm. Well, I tell you, America is a society of vast loneliness. Mm-hmm. And just being a group of people who say, hello, welcome, come in, how are you? Who are you? Tell me about yourself. Just doing that becomes a kind of vibrant Christian witness in a society of loneliness. Yeah. And we probably ought to work harder to train. I was out at a big Methodist church in Kansas, Church of the Resurrection, Adam Hamilton there. And I noticed in the men's room, and I presume they have the same chart in the women's room, they have a framed thing about how to welcome someone to our church.
Right.
First thing you do is say, give your name, stick out your hand. I guess this was pre-COVID days.
Yeah.
And here's what you say to them. It was almost laughable to see that. But I mentioned Adam, and he said, people are not being raised knowing how do you welcome a stranger. So
I believe that, yeah.
Given that ministry to us.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, so maybe this is above your pay grade, but I'm really curious because we're in the midst of this pandemic and you can see the end of it, you can see hope and you can see the end of it. And I do wonder, again, the loneliness was a problem beforehand. It was great. It's been greatly magnified because of the current situation. Do you think people will have a hunger to be in community, or again, does it just take almost heroic effort to get people to overcome that? It's an interesting challenge, but also an opportunity.
Yeah, lots of clergy are discussing that right now, and there are those who wonder, gee, we've done a pretty good job being online. I've got our services online now, and are people going to say, hey, I did online 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. It's an inconvenient hour. I'll watch later in the week. I'm fine. Or maybe there'll also be people who say, wow, I never appreciated before the joy of being able to join your voice with others in a hymn. I personally believe it's just built right into the nature of Christianity. It's a bodily faith.
Right.
We gather at a meal, sharing bread and wine, and the priest says it's the body of Christ, and you become the body. To me, even the best of online worship, I think, has been a kind of pale imitation of the real thing. And I hope, I remember watching a virtual service where the young minister is in his kitchen table. He's got the elements in front of him. He's got juice, he's got the bread, and he says, we can't celebrate communion. It's called communion. It's community. We got to do it together. And he said, so it's here as a reminder of what we once had, which one day again we shall have. And I'm telling you, when this pandemic is over, we're going to have ourselves the biggest party you ever saw, right here at the Lord's table at church. And I thought, I hope that is the future, where we again discover the joy. I think about those people that I've had in my church, say an older woman who comes out and says, okay, let me have the hug. And I say, well, the issues about hugs, but oh, okay, I'll hug you. And that same woman said to me, nobody ever touches me all week long, except you, Pastor, and all. Or I think about the joys that we receive in church of sitting there, and there's a child sitting in front of us who's making noise during the sermon and looking back at me. And I want to say to the child, I'm actually as bored by this sermon as you are, but unfortunately I can't lie down on the pew like I'd like to. And so maybe we'll learn again the joy of.
I mean, that the wanting that is, is a little bit coming back to that initial story about that young adult discovering something that was missing. And, there's maybe we can at least pray for that. People can start typing in questions. I have a couple of questions. One of them is related to the loneliness question. And loneliness can also be experienced in one's 40s and 50s. We mentioned different time periods. Finding others who understand your own experience, finding people who will listen and empathize. I have loving parents and many siblings, but sometimes it feels lonely if you don't know someone who's in your shoes, who's gone through what you've gone through. It reminds me a little bit of maybe it's Stanley Hauerwas talking about the Beatitudes, that somehow the community of Jesus is you're meant to find all these different people. You're not supposed to have all these different experiences. But ideally, the Christian community has people with all these different kind of experiences. Nice. And when you show up, there's someone there in one of these. Maybe
you are not a blessed peacemaker, but you need to find somebody who has been given that gift and that ministry. And I do. A lot of churches have really built themselves around the divorce recovery group, the parents without partners, this, that, the drug recovery, alcohol 12-step programs. And it, again, I love it when like one of my last congregations, I felt so overburdened by those with alcohol issues, and so impressed by my own unworthiness to minister well to persons with addictions. So I called together 3 recovering alcoholics in the congregation. And I said, what can I do about this? And they said, stay away from it. Do you know anything about alcoholism? And I said, well, I know a little bit. And they said, preacher, we're experts. So that meant that when I came across alcohol addiction in the congregation, I would say to someone, one of your fellow church members is going to call you within the next 24 hours. You may be surprised who calls you. Mm-hmm. You're free to slam down the phone if you want to.
Right.
But these people can show you the way out of this. And makes you wonder how many more groupings we could do, or how many others we could say, you went through a divorce after 20 years of marriage. Well, that could become a ministry for you.
Right.
There are other people who may need what you've learned. So,
yeah, the part of that is knowing who those people would be that would call. But that is a great way to, again, sort of reminds me of that image of the Beatitudes coming to life. There's one question that I know my wife really wants me to ask you, because she read it in, I think, one of your books about confirmation class. and about wearing ties or not wearing ties, I think.
Oh,
And
story of my childhood.
do you know that story, or it's about,
Yeah.
she was really very moved by that.
Oh, good.
Again, talking about, what does a Christian community look like? And
There's actually a film company in North Carolina, independent, that they made an independent film of that moment. But
really,
wow, to
tell
say
us tell us what that is. Yeah.
when I was 10 years old, I was in the membership class, we called it confirmation class, and putting us through 6 weeks and all with a very domineering personality in charge of it, a woman in the church. Anyway, show up one Thursday afternoon for it, and first thing she says, "Where's your tie?" And I said, "Tie?" And she said, "All the boys were told to wear ties. Every boy here has on a tie. Where's your tie?" And so I was fighting back tears. And I said, "I don't know, maybe my mother didn't get the mail. I don't know, maybe I forgot." And so she said, "We're all to have our picture made today on the steps of the church with the pastor and a professional photographer. Everyone else has ties." So I ran out of the room, I ran down the hall out of the church parking lot, and saintly Dr. Herbert was pulling in his Plymouth into the parking space. So I ran out there and I said, "Dr. Herbert, I'm William Willimon, and we were told to have ties. I don't remember when we were told that, and I guess I forgot. But anyway, I'm just saying, I don't have a tie, and I don't want to be in the picture. And I just want to bow out. I'm going to go wait on the bus." And Dr. Herbert had this stained glass voice. He said, "A tie? I am wearing a tie because I am paid to wear a tie. I am the pastor. You don't have any position in this congregation, do you?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't. I'm just in this dumb confirmation class." And he said, "And I know a great deal about Methodism, son, and there are no rules in Methodism that ties must be worn for anything." And he said, "Are you familiar with anything in Methodism like that?" And I said, "No, all I know is just what I learned in this class." And he said, Come with me." So we went in to the group of assembled children, and the person in charge said, "Well, they're all ready." Nearly all of them were dressed like they were told to dress. So Dr. Herbert said, "Well, the purpose of these proceedings is to include everybody into the church. I've just got one request. Could all of you boys please remove those ties? Because I'm the pastor. I've had advanced theological training. Therefore, I wear a tie, but you should not. Let's take off the ties, and then let's make that picture, and let's get everybody included. That's the whole point of this." So I said at the end, I said, "I think God is like Dr. Herbert without the blue Plymouth." I think so. Anyway, that's that story.
Thank you. I really appreciate you telling us that. It's a great picture of Christian community and sort of first things and secondary things, primary things and secondary things. One question is about given the circles that you've traveled in, the places you get to hang out. You not only get to, you have conversations with people who are peers or who are, going to be in positions like you have held later in their lives. And so you get exposed to a lot of voices, that people may or may not know of today. Who are some of the people that you think we should be paying attention to these days? Some of the voices that you've heard.
Well,
that you think that we...
Lord, in this series, you've had Sister Prégine, which her voice has been an amazing one for us. You're also getting ready to hear, I understand, Kate Bowler in the future. She's, we're very proud of her at Duke, and she's a wonderful voice on our faculty, and has meant so much to so many in need beyond the bounds of the church, and has a wonderful ministry. During the pandemic, I've been much edified by some of the thoughts of people like scholars like Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament professor, by N.T. Wright, a New Testament professor, bishop, who've helped me think about things. You know, something like a pandemic makes theologians of us all. The minute you ask, what's happening? Or what does this mean? Or why are we going through this? Or where's God? You're on your way to doing some deep theological reflection. And the church is a great place to say, glad you asked. Let's talk about that. Let's have conversations that the world finds difficult to have.
Sure. Now that's difficult for some. Now, some church people hear you say that, and they might say that's a great idea, but then when you start doing that, they bristle at the notion. They think you are going places you ought not go to. I'm only here to talk about Jesus, and I don't know what Jesus has to do with that. Just the general trouble that
ask Jesus.
Ask Jesus, the kind of trouble Jesus got.
I mean, when we say, like I think preaching ought to talk about what Jesus talks about.
Sure.
And I think preaching ought to be in the name of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Well, once you've said that, then it's not fair to say, I'm sorry, I don't want you to get into politics. And you say, did you know how Jesus died? That was the government in action. I don't want you to talk about money. And I said, I promise you, I will not talk about money as much as Jesus does. I promise that. I promise you.
He talked about an awful lot. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But also it may mean that in the present moment, maybe people are fatigued by some of us clergy, the way we do sort of gratuitously talk politics, enter it in a situation, or my own church appears to be headed toward a major division over issues of sexual orientation.
Right.
Well, I think it's important to say, Jesus, what do you think about sexual orientation? What? Well, nothing, according to what we have of Jesus. But maybe we'll learn something from that, to say that maybe let's stay focused on January 10th, after the insurrection, before the inauguration, was the baptism of Jesus. And I preached in Duke Chapel. And I said in the beginning of my sermon, I said, look, what I want to do this morning is I want to call down fire on the heads of the entire North Carolina Republican congressional delegation. I said, the cowards, they deserve it. Or I'd like to give some advice to Papa Joe about how to run the country. But Mark won't let me. Mark said, no. Let's talk about something you actually know something about. Let's talk about Jesus' baptism. And then I just said, Mark says to me that when the sky turns dark, if we are really fearful about the future, that's when you need to know who God is. And this morning, the curtain is pulled back and the voice says, this is my son. I'm pleased. So that, yeah.
That's a way of naming the elephant in the room, so to speak, but also what you're there to talk about does touch upon the things that people are worried about, that they're not trying.
Yeah, and I must say, you Episcopalians have got a great help in this in the Book of Common Prayer that just keeps forcing you back into the faith, the scripture, the prayer. This guy told me the other day that he was moving away from the Methodist church and he was going toward the Episcopal church. And I said, well, you can drink now. You, as Methodist clergy, can drink. That's okay now. You don't have to become Episcopalian. And he said, I said, what's the attraction of Episcopalians for you? He said, I didn't know how to pray. And he said, I didn't know how to talk to God. And the Episcopal liturgy, it's all prayer. It's all God. And here's how you talk to God. Read these words. You'll get the hang of it and all. I thought that was a beautiful tribute to Episcopal liturgy.
Sometimes it takes an outsider to make you appreciate the treasure that's in your
Yes.
hands.
Yeah, you need to have me down to
Yeah.
Houston to tell
You
everybody how
should preach
lucky
on
they
that.
are
I
to
love
be
that.
Episcopalian.
Someone wants to know if you've crossed paths with one of our guests in the fall was presiding Bishop Michael Curry, a former bishop.
I
of North
have.
Carolina. Yeah.
North Carolinian.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's a native North Carolinian, but he certainly
yeah,
got his
right.
going in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Wonderful guy, and what a great witness for the Episcopal Church in this moment he is.
Right. And I wonder too, like we have a little bit of time left. Thinking about, I wonder if there's a gift, and as we move into each next chapter of our life, not only at the end, but to be able to look back at the previous chapters and see, what we got wrong, things we can see clearly. And I have a humorous example, but there are very serious things that we can help people with. If it's the right kind of setting where people can appreciate, a change of mind or something like that. I grew up in North Carolina, of course, in the 1970s. I have this specific memory of, the church I grew up in was bordered on by tobacco fields on two sides. And I remember going to VBS one summer, and one of the crafts that we made in Vacation Bible School was, was an ashtray with, I don't know if it had praying hands in it, or Jesus was at the bottom of the ashtray, or something like that. And, not the kind of thing you would do today, but it was a different era. And it's interesting to look back on something like, what would I have done differently back then that I can see clearly now that I have distance from it.
I think a lot of older people, regret can be a huge burden for older adults. The road not taken and that kind of thing. Right. But I must say, the fact that you're even asking this question may be an indication you're a Christian clergy person. And I know, not to mention any names, but our former president bragged, I'll never apologize.
Right.
I will never say I'm sorry for doing anything I do. And I said, he ain't an Episcopalian. They love to apologize to God. I said, every Sunday, they meet and they sing a hymn. And the priest comes out and says, before I'm going to let you do anything else in church, I want y'all all collectively to apologize. We call it confession. And makes them confess stuff they didn't even know they had done. And feel guilty about it. Well, that can be a gift. And growing up in the South that I grew up in, it was a racially segregated, legally segregated South. I got a bunch of regrets. Well, I think wish I'd found out the truth earlier. I wish I had done many things differently in regard to race. Well, one of the joys of being a Christian is for Jesus to say, hey, remember now, I came only to save sinners. So the main requirement to be related to me is an honest to God sinner. And so you're in the right position for me to love you. And let me take these burdens from you so that you may be free to be who you know God wants you to be. So
that is a great note to end on. Thank you for that. Thank you for that thought and that picture.
And I want to say thank you as well. What a treat tonight was, and what a gift to be with you and have you join us. Watching some of the comments and responses come in, we are a people that are lonely. And I think that you talking about that and mentioning that is something really important for us all to pay attention to, both within ourselves and in our congregation and our community. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time this evening. I want to let everybody to know that what we're going to do with this is we're going to follow this up on Sunday with a conversation during the Sunday school hour at 12:30. Which we did last month, which was fantastic. And so it gives us an opportunity as a community to see each other's faces and talk about some of the things that we heard tonight. And so I encourage you to be a part of that. That information will go out in the Palmer newsletter, and it is on the Palmer website as well. And those links will be available. So Thank you, sir. On behalf of the
Thank
vestry
you.
staff and congregation, clergy.
And blessings upon all of you at Palmer Church. And
Well,
thanks for inviting me.
Yes, you got it. Thank you so
Thank
much. Everybody have a great evening.
Night.
Good
Good night.
night. Good night.